Alright, so on the PlayStation 5, you can record in 4K resolution, but that requires using a new format known as WEBM. The WEBM container supports the VP9 codec from Google, which is what YouTube uses for 2K and higher videos. So on the PS5, in the settings, when you change the recording resolution to 4K, you'll see the file type. You can't really see it here, it's behind here. We'll change to WebM. MP4 will only support up to 1920 by 1080. Now, even though you've set the recording resolution to 4K, notice it says manual. You'll see this part here. It says this doesn't apply when you're saving your previous gameplay. That's what we're used to doing on the PlayStation 4 is save last X, clipping video is previous gameplay. Well, you can still do that on the PS5, but that will only be 1080p. It will still be in WebM format, but it'll only be 1080p. So the only way to record in 4K is to start manually. So when you hit the share button, you'll have these three things at the bottom. One of them, I think the left one is the one that's save previous gameplay, and then the one on the right is start recording. And then you'll have like a little red recording indicator in the upper left corner to show that you're recording. That's going to be 4K. And it's a little inconvenient because you're going to have to know, hey, I want to start recording what I'm about to do in 4K. So it does require a bit of planning in what you're doing. The other issue is with HDR. And some games are not HDR, but if you don't have your HDR settings set properly on the PS5, the PS5 will try to convert the game to HDR. The issue with HDR is that it uses a different color space than SDR, and you might be blaming it on the WebM format, saying, hey, these WebM videos look all washed out and the colors are kind of greenish and it just looks funny. But that's not because of HDR, it's because you're trying to view HDR on an SDR device. What I've found is, at least with the game I'm currently playing, which is Rust, the game is not HDR natively. So if you set HDR to on when supported, the PS5 will run in SDR for games that are SDR, and it'll run in HDR for games that are HDR. Then the WebM that's created when you record will be SDR, at least for the game I'm playing. A little more on HDR. Don't try to convert the 10-bit color space of HDR to the 8-bit color of SDR. You're going to find a lot of websites and videos that say, oh, I just use these settings and tweak this contrast and the tone, or use this LUT to change the colors. It'll be a little bit better. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to look as good as just running the game in SDR. And there's a couple of options. Okay, so here's one. You can go ahead and edit in HDR. If your editing workstation has an HDR display, just keep everything in 10-bit color space all the way through to uploading to YouTube. YouTube supports HDR, and it'll show HDR on HDR devices, and YouTube will also convert the HDR to SDR for SDR devices. But you're going to run into the same issue where on those SDR devices it's not going to look quite right. It'll look pretty good, but it won't look quite right. Now the other option, which is guaranteed to look good, is to go ahead and just run the game in SDR. So go into the PlayStation, and instead of on when supported, if the game is an HDR game, you could change this to off, or I don't even know what the option is, SDR only, or that will force the game into SDR, and then all your footage will be SDR, and then you don't have to deal with that issue. Okay, so there's a couple of options you have to move your video clips from the PlayStation 5 to your editing workstation. One is to get just a thumb drive and plug it in the front of the PS5, copy the clips to it, take it down to your computer, copy them off. And for most people that will be just fine. On the PS5 you only have one USB-A connector on the front and then one USB-C connector. So if you're using one of them to charge a controller, what you can do is you can get, I think Kingston makes a thumb drive that has a USB-C connector on one side and a USB-A connector on the other side, and then that way that drive can be used. One end of it can go on the PS5, and then when you unplug it and take it down to your computer, you can plug it into the A port on your computer. So that's one way to go. What I'm doing now is I'm using a hard disk dock. I already have one on my editing workstation just because I archive so much footage. You could put one on the PS5. It's got to plug into the rear USB port, but once you slap a drive in there, by default, it's going to want to format it as extended storage. So go ahead and do that, but extended storage is for storing games, not video clips and media. So anyway, so this is just the first step. Go ahead and format that. Then once it's formatted, okay, so you'll see, this on there. It'll say games and apps. Well, if you click on this little 3-dot button right here, you'll get this option that says format as exFAT. Go ahead and do that. It'll give you this warning and say, well, it can't be used as extended storage, but you can use it for screenshots and video clips. Are you sure? Well, this is exactly what you want to use the external hard disk for, is your video clips. So you say yes to that, and then you'll get that confirmation screen. And now that hard disk can be used for transferring video footage from your PS5 to your workstation. And the reason why that works really well for me is I have a lot of old 3 terabyte internal hard drives that I slap into these docks, as I've moved to 8 terabyte drives for archive now. Well, these 3 terabyte drives are perfect for moving footage from the console to the PC. You can move a lot of clips. So you could just say move all the clips on the PS5 to the external storage, or to the USB drive. Go do something else, and it'll just do them all. It won't complain about the thumb drive being out of space or anything like that. So in order to support the WEBM container and the VP9 codec in Premiere, you need to download this plugin. And you don't have to take my word for it that this is where you get it. You can go to the Adobe forums or Adobe support site, and they'll have a link to it there just as well. You download it and installs it into Premiere. So in Premiere, I'm just going to go ahead and create a editing project. We'll call it Rust 1. And then in my assembly layout is where you drag in your media. So here are all my WebM files. Gonna go ahead and just drag them into the project, and that'll take a little while. And it'll even appear to lock up, at least it does for me. Okay, so once Premiere has imported the media, I'm going to go ahead and change this to a list view. So I've got all my clips here, and I'm going to just scroll and check their resolutions. Okay, so these are all 1080p. So these were all taken as clips of previous gameplay. If I had had one clip that was 4K, that would be the one I would want to use to make the sequence. But they're all 1080p, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the first one. new sequence from clip. That makes a sequence, which is sort of the workspace that you edit on top of. So that needs to be at least as big as the largest clip, which is why I was looking to see if I had any that were 4K, because if I did, then I would create the sequence from that clip. That doesn't mean that clip has to be the first one in my editing. I just used it to create the sequence, and that's what this is. In fact, I usually rename the sequence to whatever the output file name is going to be. So if I have a clip here, I'm going to start previewing it here in the program monitor.
Hang on, Layla's putting up the ladders.
It will start to choke. See, look at this. The frame rate's dropping. And
Okay, we're good.
Maybe you didn't have this problem with MP4s. Maybe it was fine. Well, the reason for that is explained in this B&H Photo Video article, which I found really educational. The difference between these different file formats. MP4 and WEBM are compressed using this Interframe compression. There might just be there's occasionally a frame with the full image, and then a lot of the frames are just the deltas, the changes from there. So while this makes the file size really small, it puts a lot of the work on the decoding device. So when I'm looking at a WebM, previously my MP4s were maybe 30 frames per second. They were 1080p, and maybe my computer was fast enough to decode on the fly while previewing in the program monitor while editing. A WebM file is 60 frames per second, and it's conceivably even greater resolution. It's just too much work to try to edit a compressed file raw like that. You need to use what's called an intermediate file, or I think there's a couple of terms for files that are used for the actual editing that don't put a lot of load on the workstation. Those are typically formats that use intraframe compression, which means that every frame has the full image in it. So the editing workstation doesn't have to do any work to go from frame to frame. So the way to fix that in Premiere is to use what are called proxies. And what these are they are files that are just used for viewing material while editing, that are lower resolution, they're intraframe, and when you place your cuts and edits and so forth and export, it's going to do all those actions on the original high resolution full frame rate files, not these sort of preview files. So you just select all your clips that you want to create proxies for. You go to Proxy, Create Proxies, and then you select, I like to use the lowest resolution GoPro Cineform. Those tend to be smaller. Again, this is just for editing. I don't need 4K resolution in this little preview monitor, right? Next, original media in the proxy folder is fine. You click OK. What this is going to do is spawn Adobe Media Encoder and queue up some encoding jobs. And those jobs will take a bit of time depending on how many clips and how long they are to create all the proxies. And so this is a fairly common practice in professional video editing, is this sort of transcoding all your work to an intermediate format or using proxies. So Premiere is still creating the jobs. While it's doing that, let's take a look at this other article from Adobe. There's a lot of information here. Mezzanine is the other word for this sort of intermediate format for, production work. Okay, so it's created the proxy jobs. Here they are in Media Encoder. It looks like it's off and running. So going back to the Adobe article, talks right here about the codec choices for the mezzanine formats, and there's GoPro Cineform, which is the one I'm using for this project. So once Adobe Media Encoder has created all the proxies, so you'll see those. I exited Premiere while Media Encoder was creating those proxies. Once I go back in to that project, it should look for those proxies that are linked to those media clips. Yep, okay. So it is checking those files. Once Premiere has finished checking all the files, the pending status will be removed. Now, even though we have proxies associated with these files, to actually use them in the time, when we're the program monitor, we have to add the use proxies button. I'm just checking all these to this row of buttons. And you do that by hitting this little plus button, toggle proxies. Put that in there. Okay, so now we're using the proxy files in the program monitor. So let's go ahead and start that video again.
Hang on, Layla's putting up the ladders.
Where before we were hanging up and losing our frame rate, it's playing smooth as can be.
Okay, we're good.
So editing those WebM files is now
All right, I'm good.
putting a lot less
She's got a bag up here.
load on the processor.
We're good up here.
Not for everything, just scrubbing around, whatever. Super fast. Once in a while, Adobe Media Encoder will run into an issue creating a proxy. It will crash out, and that's because the WebM file from the PS5 is slightly corrupted. I've looked into a variety of ways of fixing the WebMs. The easiest way I've found for right now is to use ffmpeg to convert the WebM into a 4K MP4. Well, it's going to convert it to whatever, it's the same resolution. So I just made a little batch file so that I can easily drag and drop a problematic WebM file on, and it'll just go ahead and start ffmpeg and create a .mp4 version of that file right next to it. We don't need to do this right now because it'll take a little while. And then I would substitute that. I would replace footage here and use that file instead, and then create a proxy of that, and then that would pretty much resolve the issue. I've only had that happen once, and it was an hour-long, one of like maybe 5 hour-long clips, so I don't expect it to happen that often, but that's how you would fix it. So when we're done editing the project, and we're going to go ahead and export, make sure you've got the timeline selected there. You want to use what I do is I make a modified version of the YouTube presets. Even if this project was under 2K, I would upscale it to at least 2K, because when you upload that 2K MP4 to YouTube, that will trick them into using the VP9 codec, which makes even your 1080p content look a lot better. You're going to see a lot less artifacting. You're going to see a smoother frame rate. Try it. You'll see. It does take YouTube a lot longer to process 2K and 4K footage. Depending on the resolution, YouTube has some suggested bit rates. So let's see here. So if it's a 4K file, I'd suggest 70. And if it's 2K, 24, 1080p, yeah. So we're going to create a custom preset. We're going to do match source. But then we're going to go ahead and change this to 1440. And since we're talking about 2K, it's a 60 frames per second, so 24 would be the bit rate. We're going to go ahead and use constant bit rate 24. If the sequence is 4K, I would create a custom preset, YouTube 4K CBR 70. So that would be 3840 by 2160, and constant bit rate at 70. After you upload a 2K or 4K video to YouTube, it could take them hours or days to finish fully processing it. You'll see this flashing processing HD version. When you click in, so it'll show that it's still processing these two. But when you actually go to the video,
but then again, you know, like,
go here,
if we,
and you'll
if there's
see that
only
you can actually select 1440p.
two guys there, there's no way.
You'll know that it is at least visible in the higher resolutions and so forth on desktop browsers, because that's what I'm using right now. If you right-click in the video player and go to Stats for Nerds, you can confirm that it is indeed using the VP9 codec by looking right here. If it's not done to that point yet, it will say AVC1. So when you're planning to actually change your videos to public, I like to wait until after the processing's completed. So that means these are no longer flashing. That means it's in 2K and 4K or whatever on all devices, not just desktop browsers, so that people like your smart TVs or maybe some certain phones.